This device can save your life, and coming up in this video, I'm going to show you how to install it in your main breaker panel. If you're not familiar with what this device is, this is a 240 volt GFCI or ground fault circuit interrupt breaker. And what it does is basically, without going into a lot of technical jargon, if it senses any type of a short to ground on either side of the 240 volts, it will actually trip the breaker almost instantaneously. It's in milliseconds, so you really wouldn't even feel the shock, but it would kill the power to anything you're doing on that circuit. And so it really is a lifesaver. They are quite expensive, but to me, it's worth the money, and it's something that you cannot leave out of an electric brewery. You know, beer is not worth dying for. You have to have everything on a ground fault circuit interrupt or a GFCI or GFI breaker when you're electric brewing. So let's take a look at what we're going to need to do in our circuit panel to get this done. First, a disclaimer. I'm not a licensed electrician. This video is not meant as electrical advice. I'm just showing you how I install this breaker in my panel. You definitely want to consult your local codes before you do any kind of wiring at all in your home or in your breaker box or anything like that. And if you're not sure what you're doing, hire a licensed electrician so you don't have any issues. Okay, so one of the first things we want to look at, and I just want to let you know too, some of this stuff I've already done because I had kind of an emergency brew day that I performed. So some of these things are going to be already completed, but I'll show you basically how to do them. So one of the things you want to look at first is to see if you have any slots available in your fuse panel. It does take 2 slots in your breaker panel. One of the things you can do that I did in the previous place that we lived at, the stove we had was gas and did not require high voltage electric. It was wired for it. But since I did not need that in the kitchen, I went ahead and used that, took that breaker out, put the GFCI breaker in there, and that was how I used it without having to take up more spaces in the breaker box because of the fact that I didn't have a lot left. So we've got those 2 slots there. The next thing we're going to need to do is take this off, and so we can get inside the breaker panel, and we'll do that next. All right, now we'll take this off, and we are into the inside of the circuit breaker box. And it might look a little bit scary to you, but don't worry, it's not as scary as it looks. Certainly at this point, I have the power of the main breaker on. Everything is live in here. The biggest thing you have to worry about when doing this is these lugs down here that are live. So we're not going to do any wiring at all until we turn this off, but I just want to go over a few things with you first. I am actually going to come into the bottom of the control panel, or the breaker box here, because of the fact that I'm going to run the wiring around the wall to the brewery. You can come in the top or you can come in the bottom, it doesn't matter. What I will be using as far as a connector for the wire is going to be this 3/4 inch wire retainer, and it basically has a lock nut on top, and then it also has a couple locking screws where you can fasten the wire in. As for the wire, I will be using some 6-3 with a ground. Now what the 6-3 indicates is that there's 2 hot wires, 1 neutral wire, and then also a ground. The reason why we need 4 wires in there, we want a ground, we also want a neutral so that we can run all of our 110 volt components in the control panel. And then these 2 will be the ones that supply the power. They're 120 volts per side for a combined total of 240 volts. So I have stripped the wire off to, basically I had to strip the wire pretty far down because of the fact I need to make it up to this ground lug here in the panel. And then the other parts of it will actually attach to the breaker down in this area here. And there is some excess wire. I could cut it off if I wanted to, but I'm probably just going to go ahead and leave it just in case I need to move anything around ever. And it won't hurt anything as long as you have them basically out of the way. One note on the wire, I had a conversation with Cal from theelectricbrewery.com, and he made a suggestion that made a lot of sense to me, which was to use a larger gauge wire to run to the control panel, just in case in the future I want to upgrade to a 50 amp circuit breaker. Now, some places or some electricians might say this would be against code because of the fact you have a wire that carries more amperage than your breaker or your plug on the other end will carry. But to me, theoretically, I don't think it's an issue at all because of the fact that you do have a breaker that's rated for the same amperage as your plug on the other end. So this wire being heavier gauge in between those 2 things is not an issue because on either end of the circuit, you're not going to have an overload that's going to allow this to exceed one of the other components. All right, let's take a look at getting the wire into the circuit panel. Now you can see I already punched one hole here, but if you look in here, there are several other areas that have some holes in them. And there's another one right there. Now the way that I usually take these out or remove them is you can go from the bottom side and you can just pop them up like that and then work it with a pair of pliers and remove it the rest of the way. I'm gonna go ahead and knock this one back down just to keep the integrity of the box. And your nut will attach. One thing to watch out for when you're using these retainers is to make sure that the wire or the screws, make sure that the screws that hold the wire are facing out. And I usually just tighten this down with a flat blade screwdriver. Just there's some knurls on there that make it tighten down pretty good. Then you can just tighten this down and give a couple little smacks. And so just tighten it down, make sure it's nice and secure. You'll be good to go. All right, now before we turn the lights off for the next step, I want to show you the breaker on the back side. It has a couple of these little channels here, and those channels actually correspond to a couple of plastic tabs on the breaker box on the inside, and then it's got the two metal contacts. So what we're going to do with the breakers, we'll slide those into those two plastic tabs and then snap it down inside of the breaker box. Now we're going to turn the main breaker off and start our wiring safely. All right, so one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to run our wiring. I have the main breaker off, by the way. So one of the first things we'll do is we'll run our wiring up through our retainer. And this wire is really, really thick and a little bit cantankerous to deal with sometimes. So just be aware of that. All right, so now we've got our breaker, and I am going to go ahead and install it. And it's going to go in just like this. Now I'm going to have to extend this white cord out because it just barely, it actually just barely reaches up to our lugs up here. So now this is going to, like I said earlier in the video, it's going to snap in. And then I'm going to run this underneath of all of the other wires in here. And the nice thing about turning the main panel off is you don't have to worry about getting electrocuted or anything like that. So you can kind of work around in here at ease. So we've got that there. I'm going to run this up to the top up here. Put it into the lug on the ground or neutral bar up here. All right, so I've got the wire into there. Go ahead and give it a little tighten down. If you're going to use one of these, you definitely want to be careful that you don't over tighten anything. Okay, so the next wire that we'll put into the neutral bar up there is going to be the ground wire, and we'll run it the same way. I like running these larger wires up underneath of the smaller wires so that they don't get in the way, because these things are somewhat hard to deal with sometimes. So definitely want to keep those out of the way, so to speak. It does not matter which side of the two outer contacts that you run the red and the black wire to. The white wire does need to be run to the center. So I'm going to go ahead and install the black wire first. And it's pretty simple. You just slide it into the end of the terminal. Then you're going to tighten it down. Like I said, if you use one of these, you definitely want to be very careful. I recommend if you haven't used one before on any of this type of stuff, use a screwdriver with this square bit. It works very well for these applications. Now I'm going to tie in the neutral wire into the breaker. And same way with that. Loosen this up just a little bit. Get that in there. Same thing with the red wire. Get it loosened up just a little bit. Run it in there. One of the things I do like to do is check them, make sure they're nice and tight in here. And then you can take the additional wire and you can basically just kind of curl it up in the bottom of the circuit breaker box. Pull this up through. And then once you have it up through there, make sure you've got a little bit of wire inside there, so you're only tightening down on the insulation. All right, so just a quick recap. We've got the two hot legs or power legs, 120 volt circuits on the outside of the GFCI breaker. And then the neutral goes in the center. The neutral wire that comes out of the breaker goes up into the grounding bar. ground from our wiring goes up into the grounding bar. Everything is snapped in. The breaker remains off until we get everything hooked up, and we're ready to go back together. All right, so one of the last things you got to do if you do this is you got to take out a couple of these knockout pieces. Like I did already take them out of mine, but basically all that you have to do to get them out of there is just use a pair of pliers, and you can just like basically kind of wiggle them back and forth and work them until they come loose, and they'll break, they'll snap off. They're just held on by a couple little thin strips of metal there. So once you get your two removed from the breaker slot that you've got, then it's time to reinstall everything, and we'll do that now. All right, so there we go. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. If you find it helpful and you think somebody else could benefit from it, give it a share out there. This has been Brian for Short Circuited Brewers. We'll see you on the next video.